for the future, and I don't always feel that. But you know, the idealism that Rocco was talking about, I think, is an essential ingredient to what we all do. And I have to say that after I left the discussion a little while ago, I may have felt less idealistic or somewhat reason for concern. And I guess I would put it this way, that the thing that I fear coming out of that discussion is that we may be going from a time of relative abundance to a time of scarcity. And I don't know what that means in terms of the field as a whole or of new work, but I think one of the things we tend to do in our field is bemoan our current state. And I think it's important to recognize not only the people in this room who are working in this area of new work and who are committing their lives and their work to that, but also the people who are not in this room, and not just the people who are watching it on the internet, but people who either couldn't make it, who weren't invited, who are too large or too small, or for whatever reason aren't at the table today. There is a vast amount of work that is happening in the United States, and it's very diverse, and it comes from many different segments of our country. And I think that is the future, and that is the thing that I can hold on to as a term for relative idealism as I move forward in my life of making work. I think that what the future looks like, I had the privilege of listening to a futurist talk last week. So the question that he asked at the beginning of his speech was, to you, what's the first thing that pops into your mind when you think of the year 2070? Just get that in your mind, 2070. So he went around the room. I won't do that today, but he went around the room and he asked people their response, and someone said, well, the cemetery. Someone said, my grandchildren. Somebody said, you know, there were a variety of responses. And what the futurist led to were two things: that what we can really imagine as the future is limited by our knowledge of the present, and sometimes the past. So all of the things that Meiyin just mentioned, many of the things, aside from us being underwater, were examples of what exists now, that's present now in the world, that might be on the margins in some fashion, whatever you think of as the margins. But it's difficult to imagine what does not exist, what might exist. And the truth is, we don't know. All we can do is dream it. So I think our role is to be catalysts in helping that come to be. And what I believe in that regard is that the future certainly will not look like the present. It will not look even like the recent past. There are things that we know now that tell us, for example, that demographically this country will not look like me in a few years. It will not look like me. It will look radically different. It will be much more diverse. The whole idea of race itself as a divider that makes us different from each other as we have more multiracial couples and more multiracial children, that begins to melt away, and we begin to think about other forms of identity. Race still becomes a critical aspect of our identity. It doesn't go away, but it may not be the defining thing. I think of how important it is for alliances to form between different kinds of people, between different kinds of groups, so that we can make work together or find out about who we are through a mutual exploration of ourselves in a creative process. I think that partnerships are absolutely at the central place of this in building community. Partnerships, for example, between arts organizations, community service organizations, social service organizations, education institutions, where the dividing lines, the actual energy for what gets created, comes from what's between the margins of each of those individual things, so that new things can be born that are not actually defined so clearly. I think that's where the new comes from. I think that mentorships, obviously, are interesting in this regard because in a mentorship, someone is supposedly bestowing what they know on the mentee. But I think what the power of a mentorship really is for the mentee to change the mentor, and for the mentor to learn a new way of thinking and a new way of seeing the world. I think that as far as theater is concerned, that the idea, now I run a large regional theater in relatively rural / urban, we're a blue dot in a red state. I think that large institutions like ours have to redefine their role in the community or they will go away. I completely agree with Meiyin when she says that the work is going to happen, and with Kirk, of artists who defy categorization, who defy what we know of as the current model, and who will create a new kind of model for us that we can only begin to imagine. So, you know, I've spent a lot of time thinking of what could that role be for a larger institution? How could a larger institution be important in shaping the future of new work? And I think it's by opening the doors and letting people in. I think it's by getting out of the building. I think it's by a thorough examination of what community is and means, about how we can change an idea of the art form by bringing people who maybe aren't in what we think of as our art form into the collaboration, whether they're visual artists or community members, or, as Kirk was saying, just audience members who might have something to say and do to change our way of things. Clearly, we live in a global world. And, you know, all theater is local, but we're also in a global world. So how does the international begin to creep its way into our very parochial American way of thinking? What can we do about that? How can we welcome that part of the conversation onto our stages, into our community dialogue, into our art? I think there are great examples in this room and around the country of people who are doing these things. I think we need to run to them. I think we need to embrace them. We need to welcome their energy, and the aspect of change that may be frightening to someone like me is actually the source of the future, and something that I welcome and I really am very, very curious about.
Marc did that all from a little, that's so intimidating to me. I've written my thoughts down, and since I'm a writer and owe a discomforting number of people in this room plays, it seems appropriate that I do indeed show that on occasion I write. This has been one of the most well-prepared panels I've ever had the pleasure of being on. Thank you, Deborah. We had a wonderful conversation that Deborah mentioned about things which we value and worry about and are inspired by around the future of new work. And I said several things, some of them passably well articulated, some brilliantly muddled through. Among them, the things you have heard from my co-panelists, thoughts about new models of management, sustainability, conversations about where is the conversation about aesthetics. I wish I'd brought that one up myself, as it is hugely compelling to me. Self-production and diversity. When I speak of it today, mostly I'm thinking racially, though generational, aesthetic, and class concerns are, of course, of utmost importance. I see the world through these eyes that see me and my brown skin, and I sit in lots of theaters where I'm sort of the only one. And so I have this thing on my refrigerator. This is a non sequitur. I have this thing from the New Yorker on my refrigerator that I laminated, or I think I stuck it in one of those magnet things that you slide a thing into. And it's been there for 20 years, different refrigerators, but I've had it for 20 years. And it's two people walking down the street, and one says, "You always see the glass as half trying to kill you." I identify with that, and maybe that's why I get to be a massive thinker today. So I was identified as the person who would introduce the theme of diversity and share big, massive thoughts. I think partially because it's sort of a given that the Black girl should address that which we have been exhaustively addressing long before the 20 years I've been a part of the theater world. It would be weird maybe if I didn't. Also, I have little sense of self-preservation and much practice alienating those both who hire me and most likely those who I presume to identify with and champion, who see me working again and again with institutions and people I regularly criticize. I think always of August Wilson's The Ground on Which I Stand. I think of the many theaters I've been blessed to have been produced by, big ones with grand budgets and thoughtful, smart, passionate artists, and smaller ones with not so grand budgets and thoughtful, smart, passionate artists. I note that usually the smaller ones have had the most generationally and racially diverse audiences and have been nimble enough to produce my most controversial work. And I note, I've written this in the margin, here I go. And I note that the majority of African American theaters fall into this category, and August would certainly not approve. And I wonder if the word diversity is not killing us all a little bit. It just feels slippery. It feels a bit like screaming into the wind. It feels overused and undervalued. I wonder if the conversation is not as much about diversity, our philosophical commitment to diversity, but rather the doling out of resources, the making good on promises to funders and artists about an institutional commitment to diversity, racial, cultural, and aesthetic. When I go to the theater, let's even say to a Black play, and we'll speak to this a lot this weekend, I'm sure, about what that means later. So when I go to an American play written by a Black person inhabited by Black actors, and I'm in a town that is reasonably diverse, we're at the bus stop or the drugstore or a high-end restaurant, I see lots and lots of people who look like me, but the demographic in the theater is startlingly not the same. I'm concerned. I wonder how the subscription system makes room for audience expansion. I wish for us to acknowledge a certain elitism and address how that figures into our floundering and around diversity and audience diversification, funding of culturally specific non-white theaters, selection of plays produced. I have a complicated relationship with this notion of theaters producing the hot person of color, and I am hot. That's not what I was going to say. I didn't even write that down. I have a complicated relationship with this notion of theaters producing the hot person of color, and I do see it as a problem that should be addressed. I also noticed that theaters produce the hot playwright of any color, and those of us with melanin stand out, as yes, we are vying most often for one slot, but certainly the phenomenon is not limited to us. And this is my future part. I did do my homework, okay? And I'm almost done. I see my students, my young students at Boston University. I see young artists everywhere, like really young artists who make me feel old, having a completely different paradigm around race, around diversity. And out of this, I am quite sure will come some great work. The phenomenon, this strange lack of race affiliation and a certain disturbing kumbaya-ness threatens me, as it shakes my overly articulated notions of race and class and who and how we are disenfranchised, celebrated, marginalized, and by whom we are disenfranchised, celebrated, marginalized. And I feel great encouragement for the making of new art with the tweeting and the texting and the Facebooking. There's a way that the work will land, and I'm excited. I think I see also in the younger artist still a desire for social justice and equality and artistic expression and resources, and that too heartens me.